Thank you. And thank you also to Dave for inviting me. Now, I'm going to have to come out of this to get rid of the, there we go, that's it. It's just to get rid of the recording button. So I'm going to talk about Trimontium's place in the south of Scotland in Roman Iron Age period. And I know that this is the Roman Roads Association, so I'll mention a little bit about roads, but I give you a warning at the start. I'm certainly not a roads expert, and many of you out there will know a lot more about roads, Roman roads, than I do. But hopefully I can entertain you for the next hour or so. So if we go, oh, it's now locked up, there we go. As Mike said, I'm the chair of the Trimontium Trust in Melrose, which lies quite close to the River Tweed. And we have got a society that's been in existence for over 30 years now. And I've been the chair for about 25 years over that time period. So we've now refurbished our museum, which is in the square in Melrose, and I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. This is the site of Trimontium as it currently looks. This was in the drought of 2018, and you can see the various roads passing through the centre of the fort and extending out to the east. You can see the various barrack blocks and the Principia and some of the other central range of buildings. And again, like most Roman forts, it lies very close to a water supply. So we'll just skip forward. That's how, as I say, that's how it looks today. Over the course of the next hour, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the fort and its position in, with most things, context is almost everything. So tell you a bit about what the fort was doing here. Say a little bit about the Roman roads that are nearby. Something about the rediscovery of the fort, because as you can see, there is nothing there to see in the fort fields today, even though there is quite a lot of the fort left below the surface. I'm going to say a bit about life in the border zone and why that reflects on Trimontium's position as a key node, something about potential conflict that took place, and then some of the unanswered questions, of which there are many, and then a conclusion at the end. So I'll just whistle on. Trimontium, it's not a modern made-up name. It was given to the site by the Romans. And when you visit the area, it's not too difficult to see how it got its name. The three Eildon Hills are very prominent in the flat plain round about the River Tweed in the Tweed Valley. And it's obviously been a focal node for populations going way back, long before the Romans. So it was given its name, as I said, because of Trimontium, the three hills, but also it became a focus for the Romans because of the settlement that was there. And this drone shot, you can see Eildon Hill North, and you can see the multiple ditches passing round the perimeter of what is one of Scotland's largest hill forts. I would argue it is the largest, but I think Fraser Hunter would say that Trimontium is marginally larger. It's around about 50 acres, but a very impressive fort indeed. And that has its dawning in the Middle Bronze Age. The Romans recorded Trimontium as one of the few places that we know for sure that had been given a name north of Hadrian's Wall, the site of one of those places. This is Ptolemy's map. You can see that it's sited too far to the east. There's something wrong with his longitude coordinates here, but Trimontium is almost certainly the Eildon Hills. How far north is it? Well, it's very far north. As far as the Romans are concerned, it's It's at almost 56 degrees latitude, which is way north of their main European latitudes. And all of the Roman writers who come to Scotland all talk about the long summer nights and the relatively short winter days. So it's obviously a big thing for the Romans to be this far north, and they're well north of their nearest legionary base, which was York. Now, I'm just going to say something briefly about the phases of Newstead, or the supposed phases of Newstead. Like most sites, there's wiggle room in the dates of these things. And because the Roman occupations in Scotland were episodic, that dating actually becomes slightly more important, and it reflects on some of the other things that are going on at the time. But the fort, we think, gets founded in the Flavian period, possibly by Agricola, might have been by one of the previous governors, if we believe that Cerealis, for example, ventured further north than Carlisle. So, but we think it may have been Agricola. And the Flavian period traditionally has been held to extend from 79 AD through to about 86, when there's said to be a withdrawal. And certainly the coin evidence north of the Fourth Clyde Isthmus would suggest that there's a withdrawal south to Camelin, to the Falkirk area, and possibly even further south around about 86. But I think there's a fairly good chance, based on coin evidence, and particularly new interpretation of that coin evidence from Newstead, that Newstead was held into the 110s. And the traditional date for abandonment of the south of Scotland has been about 105. And that's it's a date that's almost quasi-manufactured, really. But 105 is the date when it's said that Roman forces withdrew to the area of the Staingate. Coin evidence would suggest that that is not quite right, and that Trimontium was occupied almost until the period when Hadrian's Wall is necessitated, is built. And that's why I put, potentially until the 110s. But we can't be exact about that, certainly not at the moment with the evidence that we've got. Certainly by 122 or thereabouts, when Hadrian's Wall is being built or incepted, Newstead is abandoned. And it's abandoned for quite a while. It's abandoned almost for a generation, or again, thought to be abandoned for almost a generation, until the Antonine advance, and that's the advance into Scotland beyond Hadrian's Wall by the next emperor, Antoninus Pius. From about 139, 140 AD, Lollius Urbicus, his imperial legate, leads the advance into Scotland. And then that goes on again for an indeterminate period. Again, the accepted dogma at the moment is that's until the mid or early 160s. Remember, Antoninus Pius dies in 161, and a lot of people are wedded to the idea that as soon as Pius died, they gave up Scotland and they moved back south to Hadrian's Wall. Now, there's various reasons why that idea is mooted, but it's hard to imagine that Newstead would have been left out on its own until the 180s. And we know it definitely was, because the coin evidence from Newstead would suggest it was occupied until the late 170s, or particularly the early 180s. So it could have been an outpost fort left out on its own north of Hadrian's Wall to monitor the situation with the native levies. But equally, it may just have been lying to the south of something of remnant of the Antonine Wall occupation. And that raises the whole question of how long the Antonine Wall was occupied for. And some of the coins from the Antonine Wall do creep very close to the 170s. And very, very few coins from the Antonine Wall, only 174 from the whole wall. So that's not a particularly large coin corpus to build your evidence on. But anyway, let's assume that we can't be sure about the Antonine Wall at the moment, but certainly Newstead is held until the 180s. And then something big and bad happens. And most of you will be familiar with Cassius Dio's history of Rome. Book 57. This is a condensation of Dio's work written in Greek by a monk called Xiphilinus. But he records that the greatest war of Commodus was the one with the Britons. The tribes in that island had crossed the wall, and it doesn't specify what wall, that separated them from the Roman legions and created mayhem, cutting down a general or murdering a general together with his troops. And the Greek word for general is strategos, is used by Xiphilinus. And Anthony Birley has suggested that that is not just any old general, that it was possibly the imperial governor. So this is a big thing that goes down in AD 184, or between 182 and 184. It looks as though the rebellion is put down shortly after 184. But bad stuff happens, and interestingly, Newstead almost certainly was caught up in that because things literally stop at that point, and the fort was burned. And how do we know it was burned? Well, this is what the fort looks like in the summer crop. You can see the roads and so on. But if you look at it when it's freshly ploughed and the soil is wet, particularly after rainfall, you can actually see the carbon staining of the field. And the big square, obviously, is the fort. You can see the roads still running through it. And the dark stain beyond is where the bathhouse was. There was a sort of mansio bathhouse in that area. So the fort did meet its end, did perish, like many of the forts in the south of Scotland. It perished by fire. It was never rebuilt, as far as we can tell so far, from the excavations that have been done. So back to roads, really. Why do I say that Trimontium is a key node? Well, the only milestone from Scotland, and that's an interesting fact in itself. This milestone was found in 3 pieces round about the time of Sibbald, the great Scottish antiquarian, who was also a medical doctor. He founded the Royal College of Physicians, but he also wrote a lot about the Roman presence in Scotland, and he commemorated the finding of this stone in the 1600s. And Sibbald said that there were 3 parts to the stone. The stone's got its own story, and which is quite interesting. The stone was kept in the Museum of Antiquaries, which is not where the current National Museum is now. And then one of the pieces got lost. The lower portion got lost, and only the upper 2 parts of the column were extant. And subsequently, the lower portion was rediscovered 150 years after it had been lost. It was found in the storeroom of the museum, and the thing was put back together again. And the left-hand picture is how the stone used to look in the current National Museum of Scotland. And on the right is a video that shows you what the restored stone now looks like as it stands in the current museum in Chambers Street. And one of the things to notice is that the bottom line has the distances on the stone taken ab Trimonti from Trimontium. And obviously, this stone, having been found at Ingliston, which is quite near Edinburgh Airport, may have come from the fort at Cramond, or an as yet undiscovered fort near Ingliston itself. That's 50 Roman miles as the crow flies. So obviously Trimontium plays a significant part in this time period for the distances to be taken from Trimontium on this particular stone. The other thing to notice is the left-hand image again has got an arrow beside a section that has been pecked clean. It has been resurfaced or desurfaced in an act of damnatio memoriae. Now, for a long time, it was thought that this stone didn't commemorate Antoninus Pius, even though it says at the start, if I play the video again, oops, I'll go back one. Just go forward one, sorry. There we go. If I play the video again, you see it's Imperial Caesar Titus Aelius Hadrianus, and then it's been restored as Antoninus Augustus Pius. But for a while it was thought to be potentially Septimius Severus, because Severus, as you know, also invaded Scotland and did some building, particularly around about Cramond, and that the erasure was the erasure of Geta, who was damned by his brother Caracalla. But in fact, because the third part of the stone was subsequently found and the column re-erected, it could be worked out that there were only 2 lines missing here. And it was thought that it was an as yet unknown imperial governor that had been erased. And Tony Birley again came to the rescue here with the suggestion that the missing governor was Cornelius Priscianus. Now, he's recorded as becoming public enemy #1 when he was the imperial governor in Spain, which was 2 governorships after Lollius Urbicus, who had carried out the Antonine invasion of Scotland for Antoninus Pius. So it's possible that this stone commemorates the erasure of Priscianus as the previous governor, the governor, before he takes up his governorship in Spain, he was governor of Britannia. So it's just an interesting fact and an interesting story about this single milestone from Scotland. How else do we know that Trimontium is important? There is a wooden writing tablet from Carlisle. This is from in Tully House Museum, and through the wax, it's been incised rather too heavily, and it's quite difficult to actually show it on a standard photograph. But it says Trimontio aut Luguvalii, and that says a letter to a Roman officer called Marcus Julius Martialis. He's got a trine nomen, so he's obviously reasonably senior. And it's saying that the letter should find him, because this is the outside of the letter should find him at Trimontium or Lugavalium, which was Carlisle. Now, of course, the tablet was found at Carlisle, so it obviously got through to him eventually. His mail eventually reached him in Carlisle, or he took it with him to Carlisle, and then it was subsequently lost in the rubbish and then kept in anaerobic conditions for us to look at today. So it's just another example of Trimontium popping up in the archaeological record. There are no inscriptions from Newstead from Trimontium itself with Trimontium on them, so we're having to deduce this by second degree evidence. So, as I said earlier, I'm certainly not an expert on Roman roads, and but I will point in the direction of other people who are. And I think for the north of Britain, you can't do better than start with John Poulter's book, The Planning of Roman Roads and Walls in Northern Britain. It gives you an overview of the road system. And John, as you know, is an expert in long distance planning. So his books are always a joy to read about how the Roman agrimensores, the surveyors, surveyed these long distance alignments. We also have other resources in Scotland that will give you an overview. There's a nice little free online thing called the Old Roads of Scotland. It's a nice website, and there's a whole section on detail of the Roman roads that we know in the south and mid part of Scotland. So that's worth having a look at as well. We've also got some members who've done quite a bit of work. Walter Elliott, who's our most avid of field walkers. He's field walked the site at Trimontium for over 50 years. Walter has helped survey the Devil's Causeway, which I'll speak about in a second or two. And also Dr. Bill Loney, who's sadly no longer with us, did a lot of work on the roads immediately around Trimontium, and those are free to view on this website. So I'll just leave that up for a second, but if this has been recorded, you'll be able to take down the web archive details. And this is the sort of level of detail that Bill recorded. These are the approach roads to Trimontium. Because the fort changed configuration slightly and moved slightly in the immediate landscape, there appear to be two roads going in from the south and a bypass going off to the east, heading down towards the crossing of the Tweed. And the platform that the fort sits on is way too high above the river for there to be an immediate crossing at the level of the fort. It's a very useful defensive position, but not helpful for getting across the river to the north. And Bill planned out the road, and along with Donald Gordon, they excavated and confirmed this branch road down to the River Tweed. The bridge, the crossing of the Tweed is not certain. Walter Elliott feels that there's a ford further off to the west, but we're still to confirm that. But the feeling is that the road, Dere Street, is pointing at what is the current Georgian bridge. This is a now defunct, this was the old bridge across the Tweed. There's now a modern highway further to the east of this. And it's felt that the pillars, the piers of the Roman bridge have been lost in the infrastructure of this Georgian bridge, and we've had divers up from Chesterley Street and various other places to have a look at the river here, and no trace at all has been found of a Roman stone bridge, and it may have been a wooden bridge. We're not sure. And what's interesting, just in passing, is the thing in the background is the Leaderfoot Viaduct. And for those of you who have just seen the latest Indiana Jones film, The Dial of Destiny, will, if you were sharp, will have recognized that is the Leaderfoot Viaduct. They came here, Harrison Ford and Toby Jones came here and wallowed around in the mud underneath the viaduct, right beside the Roman amphitheatre, in fact. And they've managed to CGI in the Alps immediately behind, so it's not exactly the Ildens. So anyway, just a bit of virtual reality for you. Just a couple of thoughts, couple of observations on the nearby roads from myself. There's clearly something missing here. You can see the road goes off up from Learchild. It's pointing almost certainly at something at Berwick-on-Tweed, the area of Tweedmouth. The other two main approaches into Scotland are effectively following the M74, the direction of the M74 heading up towards Hamilton and Bothwell Haugh Fort. And in the eastern side, you've got the unmistakable traces of Dere Street going up from Corbridge and heading up almost certainly to Elgin Haugh, up on the plain round about Edinburgh. So there's this question mark off here to the east, and I'm fairly sure there must have been some installation of some sort at Berwick-on-Tweed. And then I would suspect strongly that there was a road of some sort on the south side of the Tweed, because there are a couple of marching camps on that route towards Newstead. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if, in the fullness of time, the site of Carham, which its name kind of gives it away. Car is relatively unusual name for Scotland and usually means a fort, probably of some considerable antiquity. There's just a church there and a churchyard. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there is an interval fort immediately under Carham on its way to Newstead. And then there's a road goes directly west to Easter Haprue, and another little link road goes down to Oakwood. And then there's a branch road that Walter has surveyed from Oakwood, heads back towards Dere Street. So it's quite a busy area. And again, it's you can see Newstead being a bit of a hub for these roads coming in and out. Now, I know that you've got Professor Jim Crow speaking to you about High Rochester, so I'm not going to steal any of Jim's thunder, but I just love the section of Dere Street that goes from High Rochester to Newstead. You can walk virtually the whole of that line on Roman Road. And if any of you want a holiday in the borders, I would strongly recommend it. And it is absolutely studded with amazing archaeology. This is the road, this is Dere Street, just immediately to the south of High Rochester. You can see it as the green sward heading directly south here. And if I just put in the road lines, you can see that they have got fairly well demarcated route here. And the other thing to notice are these little gems off to the west, and these are Roman graves. And I'm sure Jim is going to speak a lot more about that, but I just thought I'd show you something, a video that I took just in the last couple of months while I was in Turkey at Hierapolis. And at Hierapolis, you can see the proximity of tombs to the approach road. And also it shows you that the approach road is not necessarily straight. You can see the number of tombs here, literally hundreds of tombs, but the ones that I was interested in are the two, or three in fact, a little group of three immediately beside the road, and these are almost exactly the same diameter and construction as the ones just outside High Rochester. And Jim may talk about the graveyard at High Rochester when he speaks to you later on. I just thought I'd show you that because it's just a nice example in a setting which has got a lot more preservation than we have in Britain. Next up would be Chew Green. For those of you who haven't been to Chew Green, I strongly recommend that you do. It's a bit of a hair-raising site to go and have a look at. It has just about everything you want. The parallel lines here are Dere Street, but there are marching camps in profusion, signal towers, police fortlets, and proper full-blown forts, all in the one area. There are about 7 or 8 superimposed Roman structures, all in a relatively small area, although the biggest marching camp would hold at least a single legion there. And there are 3 marching camps, as well as these more long-term fortifications. The exact occupation period, extent of occupation at Chew Green is uncertain, but I would imagine that as long as Newstead was held, Chew Green would have to have been held. Otherwise, it would have been the most northerly defended settlement in the empire for a significant period of time. So that's Chew Green, definitely well worth a visit. If we move further north, we're heading now towards the foothills of the Cheviots. And once you come over the Cheviot foothills towards, heading towards Trimontium, you come to this thing. This is Pennymuir marching camp, absolutely stunning, big enough to hold 2 legions at one time. The tituli and so on are exceptionally well preserved. It reminds me a bit of some of the big marching camps on the A66, but it's got that sort of feel about it. And of course, Dere Street is exceptionally well preserved as it makes its way past this area heading for Trimontium. And just slightly further north, again, just before you get to Cappock, which is a little fortlet just south of Trimontium, you get a very nice, nice preserved stretch of Dere Street. And I show you these 2 videos just to remind myself that if you're recording Roman roads by drone, it's really nice to go back and re-record them in the winter time, because here's the same stretch in the winter, and you can see the gravel extraction pits much more clearly. The ones, these surfacing pits, where they're extracting surface material to resurface the road. And these show up really nicely in the snow because you get this monochrome effect. It's almost like a, you know, a sort of pseudo LiDAR type image. So just a nice little section of road just as you come towards Kapuk. So moving on to the fort itself, Walter Scott strongly suspected that there was a fort in the area. His house, Abbotsford, is actually immediately opposite my house where I'm sitting just now. The house bankrupted him, as you know, beautiful house. Again, well worth a visit, quite close to Trimontium. And in the wall is the only stone of the 22nd Legion in situ from Britain. And you can see it's the 22nd Primigena here built into the wall of Abbotsford House. Now, he acquired that, and it's not quite clear where he got it from, possibly from the Antonine Wall, but may have been from one of his acquaintances' farms further south into Dumfriesshire, because there was one other stone that commemorated the presence of the 22nd Legion and the 8th Augusta operating in concert from quite near Birrens. So we're not quite sure where it came from, but it's now in the wall of Abbotsford, along with a whole pile of other stones that he long-term borrowed from the fort at Old Penrith. So it's definitely well worth a visit to have a look at those. But Walter Scott missed the rediscovery of the fort proper. He died just as material was starting to come out of the ground, and it was particularly the founding of the North British Railway in 1846 that confirmed pretty much that there was a Roman fort, a very large Roman fort, under the fields at Trimontium. And these were excavated between 1905 and 1910. And if you look at the old maps from the 1800s, the outline of the fort is not placed on this, but you've got the fine spots of not one, but two Roman altars, and then various animal remains and Roman pottery and so on, further south of the railway line created by the North British Company. So the fort was effectively excavated by this man, James Curl, between 1905 and 1910. His excavation notes will tell you that he continuously excavated. This idea of going out and excavating for 4 or 5 weeks in the summer was not for him. He excavated 12 months of the year, all year round, for 5 years practically, and published within a year of the excavations being finished in 1910. And what a publication it was. It's become a landmark publication sought after by antiquarian and antique book collectors today, a Roman frontier post and its people, the fort of Newstead, and it's absolutely filled with some amazing images, diagrams, photographs, and so on of Curl's excavations during that 5-year period. He wasn't excavating on his own, he was doing it on behalf of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And these are just some of the illustrations, the beautiful illustrations from that book. So why was the fort there? And as I said at the start, context is everything. This is the hinterland, just immediately to the south of the Tweed Valley as we move into the foothills of the Cheviots. And every one of these red objects is a scheduled monument of Iron Age date, all across the south of Scotland. And the density and concentration of hill forts in this area is pretty unbelievable. And if you imagine that hill forts are just the tip of the iceberg, that there would be undefended farmsteads between these, and these are just the strong points of the area. If you look at the hill fort, I'm indebted to the Atlas of Hill Forts for this image. This is not an artificial separation. There are virtually no hill forts for the almost 100 miles south of the modern Scottish-English border. But the hill forts above that level are absolutely crammed in, hundreds of them. And within a very short distance of Trimontium, there are numerous forts. Now, some of these are quite small. They're no more than extended families, probably, in defended farmsteads, but they're pretty heavily defended objects. And this is just a little potpourri of them. These are all hill forts within a 20-mile radius of Newstead. These are just some of the more attractive ones to go and walk around, with lots of foundations of roundhouses still eroding from the surface. So absolutely fantastic landscape. And some of these forts are particularly spectacular. This one here is Woden Law, for example, that is very close to the marching camp at Pennymuir that I showed you. And this is the top. This is a photogrammetry pseudo lidar that Stuart Campbell, who's one of our trustees, took of Eildon Hill North. Every one of these dimples is a roundhouse about 10 meters in diameter. Now, I know it's often said that they're not all necessarily contemporaneous, but actually they all respect each other, or pretty well respect each other. So you can see that there are literally hundreds, and there are just shy of about 400 or 500 of these on the summit of Eildon Hill North, which is within a kilometre of Trimontium. And that's the reason. The density of local population, the arable farmland and so on, that's exactly the reason why one of the biggest, most active forts in Scotland is where it is. It's to effectively command the landscape. And this is another fort quite close to Pennymuir. This is Hunham Law, another stunning fort, again, absolutely covered in roundhouses. Neither of these native hill forts have been excavated to any degree at all. So we don't really know much about the data here, but it has to be assumed that there certainly was occupation in the run-up to the Roman invasion. Just brief word about the Romans who were here. You get the great and the good of every Roman garrison raising altars to their favourite gods and to themselves and so on, to commemorate their lives and their loves and the gods that they worshipped. The one that I want to concentrate on is the far right one. This is Lucius Maximius Gaetulicus, who was a centurion. You can see the little symbol just at the far right of Gaetulicus, and then it's got leg, and it doesn't even tell you what legion he was from. But there is another stone from Britain with Gaetulicus's name on it. And this is Great Chester's on Hadrian's Wall. And this stone to Jupiter comes up from there. And he's a centurion of the 20th Legion. And we know that 20th Legion, or a part of the 20th Legion, was based for a significant stretch of time at Newstead. There are a number of altars and inscriptions commemorating the 20th and symbol stones and so on. But he was obviously also at Great Chester's. And then a few years back, this popped up. This is an altar, a statue base from a place called Novi on the Danube in what is now modern Bulgaria. And it's put up by Lucius Maximius Gaetulicus. Could it be another Lucius Maximius Gaetulicus? Well, this one, it's recorded, is from Vienne, but he was an officer with the 20th Valeria Victrix. So it is the Lucius Maximius Gaetulicus from Newstead. Now, at this point, he's the primus pilus of the First Italica Legion, which is a pretty prestigious post. But even more eye-watering or eyebrow-raising is the fact that he has seen 57 years continuous service in the Roman army. So according to Tony Birley, I think he's the third longest serving Roman soldier in the empire that we know of. So there's a little bijou fact about Newstead, and you can see the long distance traveling, the long distance shuttling that these senior officers are doing. I mean, they are moving quite incredibly across the empire. So life in the border zone, I better hurry up because we're starting to run out of time. Well, the Roman soldiers at Trimontium made sure that they had their home comforts. There was a bathhouse, there was a mansio, there was a vicus, to the south. There was also an amphitheatre, and as yet, this is the most northerly amphitheatre in the empire that we know of, although we suspect that there was one at Inveresk on the River Forth during the Antonine period, and it wouldn't be at all surprising if there was, because there was a fair-sized garrison there for at least a generation. But these amphitheatres, the hollow here has been adapted, and the superstructure of the amphitheatre would have been of wood, and it was excavated in the 90s, and post holes were found at that point. So it's at the moment we're claiming it as the most northerly amphitheatre in the empire. Now, lots of finds from Trimontium, and I'm going to talk about the unusual circumstances of these because they're relevant to this particular story about Newstead being an interesting hub. Lots of material from the fort, a lot of military equipment, obviously a lot of weaponry, but astonishingly, helmets and face masks, and these are rare. And the reason for this concealment or finding of material effectively was laid out by Curll and picked up by the zeitgeist immediately after Curll's publication. And this was put up in 1928. It sits on the site of the fort. It's about 8 feet, 10 feet tall. It's a supersized fake altar. It was put up by the Borders Counties Association in 1928, and it records that the fort was abandoned at least twice by the Romans and ultimately lost by them after fully 100 years of frontier warfare. Now, that interpretation has been debated and either hiked up or dumbed down over the last 100 years or so, but that lies at the heart of some of the questions that we still need to ask and still need the answers of from Newstead. And why did Curll say that? Well, I showed you the burnt fort earlier, but he surmised that there had been significant trouble at Trimontium because almost immediately during his excavations, he started discovering sealed off, capped off pits and wells all over the fort, 117 of them. That's a lot of pits and a lot of wells, and some of these would have been refuse pits that would have started life as wells for drawing water, but they ended up their life as concealment pits, and they were then subsequently capped off. And some of these are pretty deep. The deepest one's 36 feet deep. Can you imagine the health and safety regulations for doing the excavation of a pit 36 feet deep? And Curll excavated this, or his men excavated this in all weathers, and I would predict without any scaffolding. So effectively men were being lowered down on ladders and ropes to excavate these pits. But what makes them even more interesting is that they were jammed, packed, most of them, with stuff, lots of stuff, lots of Roman equipment, a lot of it unused, some of it obviously still serviceable, some of it clearly awaiting repair or having been forcibly decommissioned. You can see that there are a couple of bent swords here in the middle panel. But from all of Scotland, the greatest concentration of military equipment comes from Newstead. And in fact, of all the forts in Britain, it has one of the highest concentrations of outstanding military equipment. And it's not just it's not just swords and shield bindings and various other trappings. There are functional bits of kit like these delabri, and these came out of the ground shiny because of the anaerobic conditions. These were absolutely stunning when they came out of the ground, and in many ways reminiscent of the stuff that comes out of the ground at Vindolanda, where they've got similar very strongly anaerobic waterlogged conditions. And these are the helmets and face masks, or some of the helmets, and the two face masks from Trimontium. The only other one from Britain that's on public display, of course, is the Ribchester helmet at the British Museum. So these two are in the National Museum of Scotland. But we have helmets and face masks on display at Trimontium at the moment from a private collector for those who want to come and see masks and helmets from this particular time period. Other interesting objects from these pits and wells, these are phalleri. These are inscribed phalleri belonging to Domitius Atticus, who was presumably the centurion or the tribune who owned these. And these would have been embossed with little figurines. And these are just the back plates, still with their original rivets in them. And these two things, extraordinary. These are standards. To imago standards, you can see that the head, the face, has been removed, but the radiate crown round about either the emperor or the gods' heads are maintained. And these are rare. These are exceptionally rare. And these were found down the pits and wells as well. And you can see here's Flavinus, who's in Hexham Abbey, the gravestone, and you can see that he's a signifier of a cavalry regiment carrying one of these insignia with a radiate crown round about the head of either a god or the emperor. So a very unusual find as well from Newstead. So some pretty extraordinary stuff. Forms the core of our exhibition at in Trimontium in Melrose, but also the National Museum in Edinburgh. Now, to add to this trouble at Trimontium, I just have to say something very briefly about the Borders brochs. You will all know what a broch is, the tallest dry stone Iron Age freestanding objects in Europe, just about. And these are stunning. If you go to the Western Isles, you'll see some fabulous examples of these. They're mainly in the north of the country, but there's an unusual group in the south, and 3 of these are within the orbit of Trimontium, and they didn't fare well. At least the top 2 have been forcibly destroyed. The bottom one is at Eden's Hall, and we're not sure if that was within the orbit of the Votadini and therefore didn't suffer the fate of all the other lowland brochs. But the one at Beaubroch has suffered a particularly violent destruction and has been pushed down the hillside. And you can see that the broch, this is not a natural collapse. This has been done deliberately. And Torwood Lee broch, that was excavated by Stuart Piggott in the 1950s, was also forcibly destroyed because of the vacillation of the fallen masonry. It's pretty symptomatic of a forced destruction. So almost certainly these brochs that sprung up in the intervening period between the Flavian advance into Scotland and the Antonine advance, at some point were considered some sort of threat to the Roman army and were taken down. And I suspect that once some serious archaeology gets going of the Iron Age settlements, because there's not been a lot of excavation on indigenous settlements to the south, we'll start finding the same sort of things that Nick Hodgson has found on the Northumberland plain north of Hadrian's Wall. So it's just suggesting that all was not well at Trimontium. And I often show this slide, the comparison of Hadrian's Wall with the German wall running through Germany. The infrastructure for the barriers that face into Caledonia are somewhat different. And these things, for example, the obstacles on the berm of both the Antonine Wall and Hadrian's Wall don't exist, certainly not as far as has been excavated in Germany or on the Rhine or Danube frontiers. So stuff was pretty turbulent in this area. This is Axel Pozlushny, who's a very great German colleague, standing in the ditch of the German limes. And if you compare that ditch with the Antonine Wall ditch, quite close to Coulside, you can see that this is a proper ditch. This is a real ditch. And this is the barrier that was facing into Caledonia. So Newstead, I suspect, reflects a garrison which is not incredibly comfortable with its position. And you can see that, in fact, the vicus is a defended vicus, as are virtually all the vici in north of Hadrian's Wall. This idea of open settlements around forts doesn't exist north of Hadrian's Wall. They are defended with multiple ditches, and there are very few places where they're not. I think Kinneil might be one place where there might be no ditches, and also perhaps at Inverest, but all the other fort annexes are defended. In fact, that was confirmed by magnetometry. RGK, the Roman Archaeological Commission from Germany, came over and did some magnetometry at Newstead with us a couple of years back. And you can see again that any evidence of settlement from the hearths and fires and so on are within these defended areas. This is not like the magnetometry trace that you would get round about a fort on Hadrian's Wall, for example, where settlement bleeds out over quite a long distance beyond the fort confines. Coming up to finish now, there are a number of things we still don't know. We have no idea, as I say, exactly where the bridge was. We have no idea where the bathhouse, the big bathhouse, there is a smaller fort bathhouse just immediately to the west of the fort, outside the fort, but there almost certainly was a bigger bathhouse somewhere for the size of garrison that was based at Newstead and the civilian settlement. And we think it's probably been swept away in the very big railway cutting that went through for the North British Railway. We don't know where the cemetery is, but we've got a fair idea of where it might be. And if the fort is occupied for 100 years, there are going to be a significant number of graves to be found. We've found cremations, but we've not actually found a cemetery so far. And we need to know more about the pits. It would be great to have an as yet undug pit to forensically examine the deposition in that pit to try and get an idea about what's going on. Because, as I said earlier, Currell felt very strongly that the mayhem of material in these pits, this is pit 17, which contain not only a lot of slaughtered cavalry horses, but bodies as well. A couple of bodies and a couple of heads. And most of the pits at Newstead, or several of the pits, sorry, at Newstead have got heads at the bottom of them. And one of the pits at the bathhouse, there was still the birch pole that the head almost certainly was on. So these are disarticulated heads. So there's obviously some sort of trouble or ritual going on. So Currell's interpretation was that a great disaster had befallen the fort. That explained the burning, it explained the widespread destruction. And there were two periods of destruction. One immediately before the building of Hadrian's Wall, which presumably matches that time of withdrawal to the sort of Steingate area, and another in the 180s, or the early 180s or late 170s, which matches with the Commodus War. So he thought there was a disaster, but that doesn't necessarily sit well with modern interpretation. We know that the Romans were very good at concealing material, particularly in Scotland. There's the almost 10 tons of nails buried at Inchtuthil, another great cache of nails in Bill Hanson's excavation of Elgin Hawk, 160 kilograms of nails there, and at Loudon Hill, lots of cart axles and delabry and so on. But nothing of the magnitude of concealment at Newstead in terms of the distribution of objects, the odd pattern of concealment. So I would still go with there being some unusual circumstances at Newstead, but there are three discordant views currently operating. So Currell's view, the older view, was that there was some great disaster. Other views, Manning's view, was that there had been a forced abandonment, a logistical withdrawal, but under some duress, a lot of the material concealed hastily, because you have to explain why. Otherwise, healthy cavalry horses are slaughtered. There's no evidence of butchery on the skeletons. They're not being used for meat. These horses are simply being killed and stuffed down the wells in a hurry. They're all piled into big knots of horse bits. And Simon Clark's interpretation that it was all ritual. This was some sort of ritual thing going on. There are other forts in the Roman Empire where there would have almost certainly been a lot of devout soldiers in, and you just don't get this degree of ritual activity, certainly not all happening at one time. So it's an unusual pattern. So that's, I think, probably for me, one of the biggest mysteries that we still need to try and explain. And of course, we come to our conclusions about these things based on our own personal view of the world. And sometimes those views will always remain discordant, and there will never be an agreement about these things. We just have to live with our own particular explanations for these things until there's a better scientific investigation. But there is no getting away from the material that has popped up in Newstead. It's very unusual, and it reflects something of its position. The museum, we've refurbished and renovated in Melrose over the last 3 years. We've raised just over £3 million for that from a standing start. The museum itself has been completely rekitted, renovated and restocked. National Museum of Scotland and Scottish Borders Council have been very, very helpful in finding material to supplement the material in our own collection. And as I say, we've got a splendid collection of Roman military equipment that will make your eyes water when you see it. And also the museum seeks to tell a story that's not just about the Romans, it's about why they were here and what they were doing when they were here. It's not such a clear-cut story anymore. And we've attracted lots of interest with the fort. Joanna came and paid us a visit just recently, but we've had a whole string of very interesting visitors to the museum. And in the last 6 months, we've erected this building. This is our community archaeology building, which sticks out the back because the core of our purpose for the society and the trust is not just education about the Iron Age and also education about the fort and displaying Roman Iron Age period finds in the museum, but also about field archaeology that supplements that information. And here you can see some of our volunteers helping out with digs in the immediate vicinity. These are just over the last 18 months or so. And you can see we've been doing some quite advanced geophysics. This is Kenny, one of our volunteers here, pushing the GPR machine. So that has shown the extent of residual foundations still remaining at Newstead. And you can see the little GIF of the foundations appearing here in the bottom left of the picture. So a lot of active work going on. So please come and visit our museum. And if I can just plug our book, The Eagle and the Bear, which is a revised view of Roman Scotland that tends to give a slightly different and perhaps more balanced view of what happened during the Roman Iron Age. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, John. Can I just ask you to stop sharing your screen now? And
that should be it, I think.
Yeah, I'm just going to change my view to, there we go, speak view. Okay, we do have quite a few questions coming in, although all rather last minute. I'm still waiting for Dave to forward them to me, in which, just while he's doing that, I'm going to actually ask one of my own. So for once, I'll get in first rather than last. I noticed on the plans of the fort that you showed that I think it was the earliest fort actually had external claviculae, which is incredibly unusual. It's unusual anyway on temporary camps, but it's even more unusual on a fort. Have you got any explanation as to why that was done?
Well, that was part of Currell's excavation, the original excavation. It's actually been very difficult to confirm that. As you know, the claviculae tend to suggest a 1st century date.
Yeah.
And are more commonly associated with camps. But I think some forts, I think there are a couple of other forts that are known to have that sort of arrangement at their gates. I've always wondered about that myself, because it looks more like a camp than a fort. And it's a very unusual shape, but it's very difficult to confirm that because of the palimpsest of forts at Newstead. It's quite difficult to be absolutely able to reconfirm that. But maybe by the time we're finished doing the GPR, we should be able to give you an answer to that.
Oh, let's hope so.
But they do reflect Flavian period marching camps, and there are a number of them in Scotland with claviculae.
Yeah, I just realised that there'll be members of the audience who don't actually know what we're talking about. A clavicular, as the name suggests, it's a curved. It resembles a collarbone because it's a curved piece that comes out from the defences. They always go anti-clockwise. Yeah,
it forces the attacker to expose their non-sword arm to the defenders.
And on temporary camps, they're more commonly actually internal rather than external, so they go inwards. But again, same thing, they always go anti-clockwise. I'm still waiting for Dave. I'll put somebody else's question. I'll start at the earliest one. We seem to be having a few communication problems this evening, so I apologise to everyone for that. I'll start at the beginning. There's quite a few. Right, the first one from, hope I pronounced this correct, Lorena. Are there any shrines or temples near the fort?
Good question, and the answer is none so far discovered. The work at the fort has largely been within the fort itself. There's been relatively little excavation and relatively little exploration outside the fort. I wouldn't be at all surprised, though, if our current plan, our strategy is to extend the geophysics beyond the immediate confines of the fort. So we should have an answer for you within the next year or two once we start doing the GPR out with the fort.
Okay. Dave's emails have arrived. Okay.
Can I just add something to that, just very briefly? There's an unusual structure was found about 1.5 miles to 2 miles east of the fort, and is almost certainly some sort of commemorative structure base. It's got east of Langley. It's got Roman tooling on the sandstone, and I think it's got a cohort mark on it as well. And it looks as though it might have been a statue base. So we think there might have been something commemorative there, perhaps for Antoninus Pius, because he was the man that was pumping most amount of money into commemorating himself in Scotland. So I suspect that it may have something to do with him.
Possibly. The fact that it's a couple of miles away is interesting. I can think of a couple of others like that. In terms of temples, if it turned out to be that, there are the quite well-known ones south of Bowes in Yorkshire.
Yep.
Which they're about 2.5 south of the fort, so similar distance, in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, we're going to move on. There's quite a lot of questions coming in from Dave. I don't know which Dave. Might be our Dave. Do any of the Scottish sites have an ongoing occupation past the Roman age, or was their occupation too short to embed a community?
That's another good question. It's quite hard to say. I mean, places like Inveresk, which is a hamlet, is a sort of satellite of Musselburgh. Again, you've got a church based on the fort, built a subsequent church based in the middle of the fort there. It's almost certain that there would have been some continuation at one or two sites, but the vast majority of Scottish sites are like Newstead. They're deserted, and then the stonework is robbed away. And now the attraction of that is that there is quite a lot of archaeology still to be explored north of Hadrian's Wall because it's not built on. But in terms of places that become something because of continuous occupation, there are relatively few. I would imagine that Inveresk is probably the only one that immediately springs to mind. But you can imagine Inchtussel, a huge Flavian fortress, that would have been, if the Romans had stayed in Scotland, that almost certainly would have become the capital of Scotland on the banks of the Tay, because it would have followed the same pattern as York or Lincoln or London and so on. So no, the answer is no. I think the occupation is too short.
Next one from Jan Scott. What natural resources might the Romans be interested in to keep them there?
Yeah, it's a very good point. The same natural resources that cause such a vast density of native population. There's clearly cereals growing in the area, and also we know for sure bovine attraction. There's cattle, and probably also horses. There's a gyrus we discovered in the geophysics that we did 2 years ago. The only other gyrus that we know about, apart from the one at Coventry, at the Lunt. So they were breaking horses in there, and there's lots of horse paraphernalia and lots of horse heads found around the site. So I suspect horses, and then of course the old resource of last resort, which is they were mining people, and they would be taking slaves and conscripts out by the shed load.
That sort of relates to the next question, actually, not the slaves, but the concentration of population that you mentioned there. From D. Still, asked what your theory would be to explain the concentration of hill forts. I suppose that's related, really.
Yeah. Well, there's two reasons, I think, for the density of hill forts. I mean, you go to the Lake District, there are no hill forts, which is bizarre because there's loads of hills. There are no hill forts at all. And there's this big gap of no hill forts in the north of England from about, from Chesterley Street up. There's nothing until you hit the big place at Stanwick St John. So why? I think it's geography. The hills. For those of you who have walked, cycled, or ridden in the Borders Hills, the Borders Hills are just the right height for hill forts. They're like the hills in Wales. They're like the hills in round about Shrewsbury and so on. They're just the right height. They're defensible, but they're still sensible heights that you can have a defended settlement, not too far from a water supply, not too far from your crops, not too far from your flocks and your herds and so on. It's just the right geography and the right natural resources. So I think that's the reason why, and it's not some supernatural reason, because you go into the more barren areas of the lowlands of Scotland, there are no hill forts.
I'm just going to very quickly go back to an earlier question, because Rebecca Jones has put a comment in, and she would know. Apparently claviculae are recorded as late as Hadrian elsewhere in the empire. I wasn't aware of that, but we know now.
Well, Becky would know, and she would. Say, I was a bit twitchy about answering that one with her.
Yeah, very good question here from Sally. Are you losing any archaeological evidence from the continuing ploughing of the fort site?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Not just archaeological evidence, night hawking as well. We've got a program of doing something about that now. But the biggest damage to the site undoubtedly is agricultural. The bronze objects are literally melting in the subsoil. And with the phosphates, and of course that becomes phosphoric acid and sulfuric acid and all the other things that it becomes. So yes, and the landowner, who is hugely enlightened after we met with him, he has agreed to take the 2 fields out of cultivation.
Oh,
so
brilliant.
the fort fields are now out of cultivation, certainly in the medium term, and that's great for exploration, but it's also great for preserving the material that's in the subsoil.
Is there anything you can do to mitigate the effects of the phosphates already there?
I don't know the answer to that. I think I would think hydration is going to be the thing that, you know, will, is what's preserved stuff so far. I think the drying out and then the wetting, and the drying out and the wetting is chemically is very bad. It makes for unstable microcurrents in the ground, and certainly the bronze objects that we're taking out the topsoil now are really badly diseased, and that's almost certainly agricultural and partly due to the other reasons for acidic soil in the area.
I'm just trying to make sure I get the sense of this next question. From Mini Kilt Tours, would you rather the fire was started by the Roman residents or by local peoples?
That depends on your point of view, I suppose. It depends on your bias. It's going to be, I think, impossible to tell. We know from written records that the Romans would torch their own forts if they were in trouble. The thing about the forts in the south of Scotland is that they're burned in situ. They're not dismantled and taken off site and disposed of the way they are in the north of Scotland. That's north of the Antonine Wall. The forts there are disposed of, and the Romans have finished with them, are disposed of in a very methodical fashion. Inchtuthil, the fortress at Inchtuthil, is a good example of that. Once you get south of the Antonine Wall, stuff gets burned in situ, and that is a very, very provocative statement, either by your own people or by whoever else is burning it. And that's pretty unusual. And I suspect that this all fits into these periods of turmoil. There's no civilian development in Scotland at all. Scotland effectively is a war zone for 350 years. There is no attempt at civilian development at all. And the Roman army is coming in and out. There are 20 significant wars recorded by the Romans, and that doesn't count smaller incursions and policing, you know, events and minor insurrections. These are major events, 20 over the course of the occupation in Scotland. Big armies. When Severus comes, that's genocidal. That's coming here to try and kill everything that moves. So there's clearly a lot of flux through the lowlands of Scotland and into the foothills of the Highlands. And the Romans are rather like Daleks. They can't handle the Highlands particularly easily because they can't get round them. You can get round the Alps, but you can't get round the Highlands of Scotland because they back onto the ocean. So there's disadvantages to the Roman army operating. I suspect that there was a time of turmoil with periods of truce or periods of where they're parleying and doing some sort of minor business with the indigenous peoples, but the majority of the time it's a military conflict zone.
You've partly answered the next question already, actually, John, but it's slightly more specific to one thing. From the Digging Gardener, is that's somebody you know, I'm guessing?
No, it's not.
All right. His question's really to do with, which we've touched on, the common practice of the Romans on abandonment of a fort to remove everything so that it was could be of no use to native peoples. Not really sure whether it's a question or a statement. But we've basically covered it. Just to acknowledge the fact that he's asked the question, because you have covered it. I've read it properly.
I think to get inside the mindset of the Romans, you need to read the ancient authors. You need to read Tacitus and his descriptions of what's going on the frontiers in Germany and so on. And you absolutely need to read Josephus, because that is the only voice that gives you an idea from the other side about what's going on during these campaigns. And if you haven't read Josephus, I don't think you should be talking at all about, you know, what goes on during Roman occupations, because he's the only, you know, he's the only counterbalance to Roman propaganda.
Indeed. I think most of it's available online. I think it's available online.
Yeah, it's great. There's a fabulous new translation that is so readable, it's unputdownable, and it's a great read. So I would recommend Josephus,
Okay.
The Jewish War, to everybody.
From Sam Scott Moncrief. The seeming absence of a stone bridge over the Tweed is odd, especially given the fort's duration. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be? You did touch on that in the talk. He then says, is the only possible answer a timber bridge question? Well, I'm going to get in and deal with fords before you say a word, because this is a particular bugbear of mine. Over any major river like the Tweed, a ford makes no sense whatsoever in military terms. And yet there is this persistent idea that the Romans used fords all over the place across major rivers. They really didn't. We have no evidence for a ford across a major river anywhere in this country.
Well,
it's not practical. Anyway, up to you, John.
No, that's fine. No, that's a useful statement. And Walter Elliott is very keen on the idea of a ford off to the west of Trimontium, but you've kind of answered that question. Disappearance of masonry in the vicinity of Newstead is legion, as they say. Not only did a stone fort disappear completely for nearly 2,000 years, we've lost an abbey as well, the original Melrose Abbey on the peninsula. We've been looking for it for the last 100 years and we can't find a stone. So there has been phenomenal, fierce reuse of masonry in the area. You just have to go and look at the modern abbey or the more modern Melrose Abbey, and you'll see that what stone robbing has been going on. So it would not surprise me at all if the whole of the Tweed abutments have been robbed out and reused elsewhere.
Yeah, it's pretty common across the whole country, I'm afraid. Yeah. We've lost an awful lot. Relatively recently, most of it from the 18th century onwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving on, just close this down. We've got quite a few. From Meg Hardy, another good question. Did the Romans use maritime resupply?
Yeah, almost certainly. We had a talk probably about 15 years ago by Raymond Selkirk, who was very keen on barge supply. And we know that an oar has been found in one of the wells at Newstead, or a steering board, I think it is, has been found in one of the wells at Newstead. But he felt that the Tweed was almost certainly weird for, you know, with raised sections for barge supply. And we know for sure they were definitely resupplying the Antonine Wall, both at Cramond and at Inveresk by sea. And there's all the rearrangements at South Shields for the granaries for the Scottish invasions under Severus, and that's bringing stuff up the east coast and taking it either to Cramond, which is the only place that's got Severan occupation on the Forth, and then Carpoo on the Tay. So yes is the answer. And it would be crazy that they were bringing everything up Dere Street. And the other thing is oysters. When we field walk, we find oyster shells at Newstead. And these oysters, we suspect, have been brought up the river from Tweedmouth.
Makes perfect sense, really. Although I know not everybody in the audience would agree with Ray Selkirk's ideas, just to balance that slightly. But in terms of supply by river, I don't think there's any question that it took place. From Susan Rams, who is very interested to hear about the gyrus and wants to know where she can learn more.
We are just about to publish the geophysics done by RGK. So we should have a report for you, but it's got exactly the same diameter as the one at the Lunt at Coventry, almost exactly the same diameter. So it's outside the fort to the southeast.
Right. Okay. The digging gardener again. With the issues over preservation along Hadrian's Wall, Vindolanda and the current Magna investigative excavation come to mind. Do you think there's a worry that the anaerobic conditions at Trimontium may be under threat with climate change particularly?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen normally the crop marks only appear once in a blue moon, but we're getting crop marks almost every year now. So the conditions are becoming drier. As part of our strategy for the site for the next sort of 5-year block, we're looking at installing monitors, subsoil monitors, and we're discussing with Historic Scotland about doing more work on the site to look at the state of preservation of subsoil structures.
Yeah, because that's happening at both Magna and Vindolanda as well, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And there's more. Susan Rams again. Who needs a Ford when you've got Batavians? You want to elaborate, John?
The Batavians were recognised as assault troops who would swim with their horses while fully armoured. It's an interesting concept. There were Batavians fighting in Scotland, but we don't have records of Batavians at Newstead. So who needs a Ford when you can swim with your horse?
I think at the moment this might be our last one, unless they're still coming in. If anybody's got a further question, please don't mind asking. Q&A sometimes run on for longer than the talk, so I didn't warn you about that, John. Sorry.
That's all right.
From D Still. What about the local conflict conditions necessitated? Sorry. Oh, I think it means what if. What if the local conflict conditions necessitated a cavalry garrison rather than infantry?
Yeah. There's a preponderance of cavalry paraphernalia at Newstead. I mean, everywhere we go, when we field walk, if we're doing any of the sort of scheduled metal detecting, it's Roman horse harness that comes up, bits of Roman horse harness, milling glass beads from the necklaces that the horses wore, and so on. Yeah, and all these dead horses. So, and there was also a cavalry regiment from Orange commemorated there as well. I think it was the Visconti from Orange. So you've got definite evidence of cavalry there. And it makes sense. Cavalry for the Romans was like the Air Force. It could range over quite large areas when they were needing to patrol. And if you assume that most of these forts are just slightly on edge for a lot of their existence, that patrolling function, that reconnaissance function is actually quite important. And you don't do that by humping a big shield and walking in your caligae northwards. You're going to do that by sending horses out.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the cavalry regiment at Newstead probably was either a 400, 500 strong. The biggest rideout of the Borders rideouts is, I think it's about 400 horse at Selkirk, modern rideout. And when you see 400 horse gathered together, it really makes your hair stand up on end. So you can imagine what Roman cavalry would have looked like when they were belligerent. And this is a serious fighting force, a cavalry regiment, and I suspect there were several of them in Scotland. We know that there were Spanish cavalry regiments further north. But then you've got the static barrier of the Antonine Wall. So you must have had some cavalry there, but a lot of infantry. So it's yeah. I suspect that the conditions, the geography of Scotland lends itself to cavalry reconnaissance.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, oh, there's another one just come in. Yeah, there's a few more coming in. I'm just going to wait for that. I'm going to put another one of my own. With reference to the heads that you've found in the pits, has any analysis been done, isotope analysis, for example, to try and identify where they came from, who they were?
Yeah. Well, there's a story to the heads, and Becky Jones, God bless her, has tried to find our heads. The heads were all recovered during the period of the Edwardian excavations and were farmed out to the great and the good to do phrenology or whatever it is that they used to do in those days. And all bar one have been lost.
Oh dear.
So, and we've tried our best to find these. I've contacted universities, I've contacted museums and so on, where we know that seats of learning were that you know, Glasgow University is an example, Edinburgh University is another one. And Becky's put out an all museums call, and we've not been able to recover them. There are various other skeletons that we need to know about. There was a skeleton found in one of the pits that was of a 14-year-old girl, intact in one of the pits, and you know, what was she doing down there? And we would have loved to have done some analysis on that. The only skull that we've got left is the one that's in the museum. It's on loan from the National Museum of Scotland. He was found in a pit, upright. The skeleton was jammed in the pit in a vertical position, feet down, head up. And in the pit with him was a native spear. What he was doing down there, we've no idea, but we've got his head. We know he had 4 active abscesses in his mouth at the one time. He's almost certainly local, but we've not been able to do any more isotopic analysis. COVID put paid to that. We sent off specimens. Nothing happens fast in archaeology, I've discovered. It's one of the great frustrations if you come from the NHS.
Yeah.
it's like glacial. But the specimens went off 4 years ago, and we've only just heard that the radiocarbon date for his skull actually fits the Flavian period. Big, that's good. But none of the other analysis has come back, and we're waiting for DNA to be done, which hopefully will give us some answers and some of the other isotopic analysis of his teeth.
Well, when that does come back, John, that gives us an opportunity to invite you back for another talk. Meanwhile, there's another question. Is it all possible that the militarization of Hadrian's Wall corridor forced the displacement of native populations north, contributing to the massive concentration of settlements? Might that concentration have led to resource shortages, which would have encouraged native attacks and insurrection? That's from Jean Nixon.
I mean, I think Jean's right. Certainly the work that Nick Hodgson and his team have been doing in Northumberland would suggest that Hadrian's Wall was a bad thing for native settlement, certainly north of the wall. And the nature of society changed quite dramatically within a cordon sanitaire of 50 miles north of the wall. I suspect into the lowlands of Scotland it was actually much wider than that. Not enough excavation's been done, not enough dating's been done. In fact, almost bugger all has been done in the south of Scotland on the native sites. There's only one completely excavated fort in Scotland, and that's at Broxmouth, which I think is a national disgrace. But that's I'm sorry, that's just a view that I've got in my bonnet. We're punching at ghosts here, trying to nail down some of the detail, and the only way we're going to get that is to get evidence from some of these 400 or 500 forts that there are in the south of Scotland. We're not exactly wasting resource to excavate 1 or 2 of them. At the rate we're excavating forts in Scotland, it'll be the 25th century before we excavate 5% of our repertoire. So we're not exactly burning up natural resources by our speed of excavation.
No, well, yeah, I'm going to keep my mouth shut on that because you're not alone. Trust me, it's not just a Scottish problem.
Well, I'm not keeping my mouth shut, and I'm quite happy to do it.
No, I'll just descend into a rant, I'm afraid, John. So no, I'm not going to do that. We've actually still got a couple of messages coming in. There's two that are very similar here. One from Lorena again. Apologies if I mispronounced that again. Wasn't there an entire human, a dwarf found in a well? Am I misremembering? And the digging gardener has also said something similar. I read in one of your slides that a pit had a person with dwarfism. Yeah. Might be interesting to find that skeleton for analysis.
That's the one that we've looked for. We can't find it.
That's the one you can't find.
It's gone, and it's pit 17 that body was in. And what's interesting is the Edwardian archaeologists could not, the Romanists at the time could not come to terms with the fact that there would be an adolescent girl in one of their pits. So they called her a dwarf. And in fact, there was a reassessment of her skeleton in the late 1950s, which suggested it was a young woman that was in the pit. It was not a female dwarf. And interestingly, there's a very, I looked at it last night, the paper from 1960, and it's hard to imagine how we've moved on in terms of political correctness since the 1960s. But the conclusion was, it is not difficult when you look around the streets of Glasgow to see women of stunted stature. So yes, it's an interesting.
Yeah, it certainly
paper.
is.
But the skeleton is lost, and we would love to. There is another female skeleton that does exist, and the Broch at Torwood Lee that was forcibly destroyed by the Romans has a native female skeleton entombed within the fallen masonry. So that is that her skeleton, or bits of her skeleton, still exist, and we're struggling at the moment trying to get access to that to do some analysis. It will take the diagnosis of what's going on a bit further. There's a lot of inertia in the system. I don't think I've got enough years left in me to make much of a difference.
We've still got another two here if you've got time, John.
Yeah, sure.
One has actually come direct to me, so whether that's the question has been put to me. If Becky was still here, this is probably better for her, but anyway, we'll do our best. It's this from Kenneth. Were the temporary camps used by road builders for logistics as they progressed along? If so, why? I've got a window covering up what he says. If so, why are more large camps, or did they stay in tents, or hence no large fortified camps along the road? I think there's two questions in one there, really, isn't it? Were camps used by road builders? Well, yes, we think so. But we can't say definitively which ones. Some of the more peculiarly shaped ones, probably, which there certainly are. Along Hadrian's Wall, for example, there's some very oddly shaped ones for no particular reason. And there's similar. There's a lot of little camps, and not little, but small air camps along the Antonine Wall. Yes. Interestingly, 80 or 90% of them on the south side of the wall and not on the north side of the wall. I wonder why. I wonder why. I'm not really sure what he's getting at as regards large camps, because some of them are immensely large, but that's because they had immense armies. The Severan camps in particular, some of those are absolutely huge, aren't they? Yeah, massive. Some of the biggest camps in the empire. Yeah. The Digging Gardener again says more funding for heritage with 4 thumbs up. Well, we'll all agree with that. Yep. Another question. Is there any damage occurring following the unlicensed use of metal detectors? Well, of course, it's just plain illegal. Yep. The answer is yes. And the thing that worries me the most, because the coin evidence is used to help date, to help create pegs of the toings and froings of the Romans in and out of Scotland,
the loss of coins particularly is a bad one, and that's what I worry about most. We're losing potential dating evidence that's almost impossible to get from anywhere else. I mean, I would challenge anybody who's still listening to go into their crockery cupboard, not the one that they actively use, but the cupboard that they keep their larder in, and find crockery in there that goes back to their granny's wedding tea service, as I've got here. You know, if our house was to get knocked down, you would have people dating our house by my granny's tea service, whereas randomly dropped coins are much more appropriate for nailing down dates, because they're random. They're not like hoards, they're random pocket losses. And that's much more useful, even though coins stay in circulation for a long time. And Richard Brickstock, who's going to be one of our speakers coming up, has developed a system to date when these coins are being dropped.
Yes, he has.
Deposition period rather than the mint period. And loss of those to illegal metal detecting, I think, is a tragedy.
I couldn't agree more. That's yeah, there's danger of another rant coming there, so I'll
well,
move
I have
on.
to say, we find that legal metal detecting, I mean, I'm a radiologist, and you use the best test that you have to give you the answer. You always go for the biggest bang for your buck, because to fiddle around with stuff that doesn't give you a big bang for your buck is stupid. And I do not understand the failure to use routinely metal detection on routine archaeological digs and sites. I just don't understand that.
I completely agree.
Losing so much material.
Yeah, entirely agree. Well, we have good relationships with several metal detectors on some of the sites that we've worked on.
Detectorists.
But I'm going to leave them nameless for now. And the final question, I think, oh, hang on. This is a message from Rebecca. Becky Jones. Difficult to disaggregate the camps at Newstead because there are so many. You would assume smaller ones for work groups, such as those building roads, forts, etc., which we touched on.
Yep.
Sorry, Becky, I didn't see that until a few seconds ago.
Absolutely.
And finally, just for information, I'm presuming that this is from somebody in the States, and there are many young females in Native American middens that may have been murdered or sacrificed, always outsiders to the local community. Whether there's a parallel there, I assume what's been suggested.
And yeah, I think, again, you know, it's one of the things, I'm just going to rant very, very briefly, but anthropological comparisons are one of the things that I think we don't use enough of in Britain. There's almost an abhorrence for using anthropological, you know, examples. And in America, you know, before you get studying archaeology, you have to study anthropology. So I think that comparisons, and I spent a year in the States, and there's no Romans in the States. My wife had a sabbatical there, so I had to do something for the year. I was looking after the kids at home. So I spent that whole year studying the move west of the settlers under the umbrella of the 7th Cavalry and the various other army regiments that moved westwards during the Great Migrations into the native lands. And the parallels and the thinking that came from that, I have to say, seriously affected me. And I think we don't study enough examples of current or more current affairs and events. Human nature doesn't change.
No, it doesn't.
Technology changes and customs change, but human nature doesn't change. And I'm very interested to hear that about the bodies of young women appearing in mid.
Yeah, it's not something I was aware of.
Yeah.
Right, and finally, that's it. So thank you everybody for the long list of questions. And thank you, John, of course. And I have to thank some other people as well. We've had quite a lot of donations as a result of tonight's talk, way more than we've had for any previous one. So thank you everybody who donated.
Yeah.
So one last thing, booking is open already for our next talk, which is Nick Hodgson, who you've mentioned a couple of times. And he's going to be talking about the Ninth Legion and what happened to it. Needless to say that we expect that one to be extremely popular. So
I'll be there.
I have to be. Yeah, we look forward to seeing most of you there as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up to say thank you, John, once again for an excellent talk and a brilliant Q&A as well.